Hey guys, Pablo here with Meditation Amsterdam. And in this video, I would like to touch upon the last quote that I want to comment on from the book, The Hero's Journey, based on conversations with mythicist Joseph Campbell. Fantastic little book, and has opened the door for some follow-up books, at least in my case. One of them is Joseph Campbell, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, which is this one here, right? It's perhaps his most important work. I can't wait to begin reading it. I'm very curious about it. It's all about essentially living the hero's journey and the whole process by which you go about developing the self. And once again, one of the things that, or there are several things that make Campbell and this whole mythicism story very interesting. But it is primarily this idea that mythicism as a body of literature, or as a field, if you will, touches upon these different archetypal characters. And the reason mythicism resonates so deeply with us is that the characters in the myths are archetypes that we hold very deep in our own psyche. And all those archetypes live within us in a sense. In fact, these stories are so profound, and Campbell had such a big effect on so many different artists that there are a lot of movies and books that are based on his work or inspired by his work. One of them being the Star Wars saga, for example, right? So George Lucas was fully inspired by the work of Joseph Campbell. And if you look at Star Wars closely and you remove all the spacey bits, or the fact that it's based in space, all the notions of the Force, good and evil, disciplining the mind like a Jedi, and all these kind of things are Taoist concepts of yin and yang, good versus evil. The idea that meditation can make you very powerful and well directed, but it requires a certain type of discipline and asceticism and so on. And so his effect was very profound. And once again, right, it is in line with the idea of this book, which is to start discovering these things in your own self. And so I wanted to close the quoting of The Hero's Journey with this last video, which was precisely about how does mythicism relate to and the archetypes relate to meditation. And the link is actually rather simple, and that is that well, let me read a quote, and then I'll elaborate. So this is what Campbell said. He says, he's talking about how when people go to university, they should get a lot of mythical education, right? So read a lot about myths. And he says, because the idea is that we are probably being related to by a myth, and we are being lived by it unconsciously, because we are too stupid to study the myth. And there's a big difference between living something consciously and being lived by it. Okay, so I'll repeat that part, because this is exactly where meditation comes in, and it's a super important point. So there is a very big difference between living something consciously and being lived by it. Okay, now let's step back for a moment and speak about what that something is that is living us very often. And this is where the mythical archetypes come in. So when you read Carl Jung, not that I have done that very thoroughly myself, but I have begun reading into the whole archetypal, archetype-based psychology of Jung, what you start to understand is that archetypes seem to have grown from our evolutionary past. So the archetype of the magician, or the archetype of the lover or the warrior, or the precocious child, for example, or the hero, all are those sort of modes of being, if you will, that go very, very deep, and they have to do with a combination of our attitude towards discipline, dominance, sexuality, you name it. So combinations and levels of maturity of all those angles generate archetypes, okay? And in Jung psychology, what you have is that there are archetypes that are for a child, and there are archetypes that are for meant to what you are meant to become when you're an adult. But even if you are an adult and you are living a certain archetype, the archetype can sometimes go a little bit wonky, right? So it can be too yin or too yang. And what you see with archetypes that are too yang, they tend to be overly dominant and aggressive and toxic in that kind of way. And when your archetype is too yin, then they tend to be kind of sort of lazy, too passive, not engaged enough. So, for example, if we took the archetype of the magician, which is the archetype of the adult who's highly curious and investigative, right? Loves to figure things out, and with that knowledge, that person then goes out to make amazing things happen in the world. Well, the yang version of the magician is somebody who starts abusing their knowledge, their amazingly acquired knowledge that nobody else has, in order to sort of just accumulate undue profits and trick other people, right? So you can see that, and I forget what the yin archetype of the magician was, but it might be something like using your gifts to sort of just, I don't know, manipulate others and make them do stuff for you while you kind of just coast along and do nothing, right? So that would be kind of a yin attitude to life. So you can see how these archetypes can go wrong a lot of the time. And so when Joseph talks about something living us, or living something consciously versus something being lived by it, what he means is that unless we develop a certain level of conscious awareness, chances are, and this would hold for most people actually, chances are there's a certain archetype that is dominant in your life, and chances are that you are either on the yin or on the yang side of that archetype. And more often than not, because you're not centered, you're actually sort of flipping neurotically between the two, because those two poles, unless you're very lopsided and you're overtly yang, very often you flip between the two. And so as opposed to being in this concentrated, smooth and productive flow, you are neurotically flipping between being too aggressive and too passive, or being too chaotic and too rigid, all right? And as opposed to hitting that sort of lovely middle. And so here comes, of course, the obvious conclusion, which is that if you want to be aware of the archetype that is living you, in other words, in a sense, kind of possessing you, in order to be aware of that, meditation is a very powerful tool, because you start to become aware of your own patterns of action. Now, here's where another element comes in, which is that meditation alone may not do the trick, because see, the thing about archetypes is they are much more powerful than small habits. In fact, archetypes would trigger a series or a whole host of behavioral patterns as opposed to a single one. So if you are someone who, say, tends to be late for meetings, now that is not necessarily an archetype playing out. It could be that culturally you were kind of raised that way, or you just consider that very individual thing in your life not to be that important. But if you are doing a number of things that, along with being late for meetings, match a certain archetype, meditation alone might not take you all the way through. Maybe you have to read a little bit of Carl Jung, for all we know, or get a little bit of therapy. And then you start joining all those dots and go, oh, I am way too yin in my approach to life, and I seem to be, quote unquote, possessed by the whatever archetype, right? And okay, so now that's something to work on, and you can shine the light on it. I find Jung, and if you listen, for example, to Jordan Peterson, he says that reading Jung is terrifying, and that the reason it's terrifying is suddenly it confronts you with just how immature and you are, and everything that's wrong in a sense, right? And it's suddenly like, oh my God, it's like looking at this mirror and thinking, yeah, I have a lot of things to develop for myself. But so the other, you can see it the other way around as well. Reading Jung alone is like, okay, so now you're aware, but unless you do meditation, will you have the mind power and the real-time awareness to change those patterns and do something about them? So that's the final point that I wanted to make in quoting The Hero's Journey in Joseph Campbell. And it is this idea that the patterns in our lives can sometimes be out there in isolation, right? Like there might be one pattern that you have to work on and that you want to improve. But more often than not, there's going to be an underlying archetype that is creating a host of patterns and behaviors that you want to change. And therefore it helps to see it at an archetypal level and realize, whoa, I am the yin version of the warrior archetype, right? Or the other way around. And so now there's like another level of awareness, because you were at some point caught in the symptoms, but you couldn't see that there was one root cause, which is this single archetype. And if you combine that with meditation, that can be a very powerful combination, because then you are developing raw mind power and awareness, which allows you to notice this more accurately. And it also allows you to observe it and, in a sense, de-energize those patterns so that you can start eroding them in a non-confrontational and very constructive way, as opposed to trying to fight your patterns and become all upset about the fact that you are, too yang a warrior or something of that kind. So there you have it. So that's the last quote about the hero's journey from Joseph Campbell. The importance of mythicism, the importance of understanding the archetypes that, in a sense, possess you as you live through life, and that knowing that you are subject to possession. So in other words, what Campbell calls the big difference between living something consciously and being lived by it or possessed by it makes all the difference in the world. And if you combine that, of course, with meditation, then you can start crawling out of this level of activity and consciousness and make it to the next level. And by the way, it's an ongoing, lifelong process. So there's no such thing as, well, I've made it because I know my archetype and grew out of it. There's always the next thing to do. But I thought that was worth sharing. It's certainly given me yet another angle or another level to understand things and self-development and so on. So I hope you find that interesting. I'll leave you with that thought, and I'll come back, and I think it'll be time now to switch to a different book. And I think I have something already in mind. So I'll talk to you guys soon. Cheers.